Namaskar, welcome to NewsKase by Kalam IAS. This is Vasudev Singh Bhati, and today we are going to do a very important topic which was in the news in the last week, that is related to poverty estimates in India. Now, NewsKase basically brings you the important news which have been in the news in the past week, and which there is a probability that the question can be asked in UPSC prelims or mains on these topics. So we cover these topics holistically. So the topic of this week is poverty rate in India, and when we talk about poverty rate in India, there were recently comments made by the CEO of the Niti Aayog, BVR Subramaniam. BVR Subramaniam said in a interview that the poverty rate in India is less than 5%. Poverty rate in India is probably less than 5%, and his comment was based on the findings of household consumption expenditure survey conducted in 22-23. Now the household consumption expenditure survey was last conducted in 2012. After that 17-18 survey was scrapped because of the quality of the data. Government said that the quality of data is not good, and after that, the 2023 consumption expenditure survey has been conducted after a gap of more than 10 years. And according to the data given by the household consumption expenditure survey, the CEO of Niti Aayog, BVR Subramaniam, has said that Indian poverty rate is probably less than 5%. Now, what does it actually mean, and why did he say so? Now, if we look at the data given in the household consumption expenditure survey, the data says that the rural household consumption level, the average rural household consumption expenditure per capita, per person, for the bottom 5% people, the poorest 5% of India's people, the poorest 5% rural population in our country was spending at an average rupees 1,373 rupees per person per month. 1,373 rupees per person per month, which translates to 45 rupees per day, which translates to about 46 rupees per person per day. So the survey says that the poorest 5% people, the bottom 5% people in the rural India are spending at an average of 46 rupees per day, and the 5% just about that is the people who are not in the poorest 5%, but 6% to 10%, the people who are richer than the 5% but poorer than the 10%. So 6% to 10%, where the bottom 5% to 6% people in the rural areas, the average expenditure by them was 1780 rupees, translating to about 60 rupees per day. About 60 rupees per person per day was the consumption expenditure, and based on these findings, the CEO of Niti Aayog said that the poverty rate in India is less than 10% and probably less than 5%. Now, all the poverty lines in India are based on consumption. All the poverty lines in India are based on consumption and not on income. If if there is any question in UPSC prelims that what is the basis of defining poverty line in India, whether it is income, whether it is consumption, whether it is any other criteria, it is the consumption. The poverty line is decided on the basis of consumption, and the last poverty line, the latest poverty line is as per the Rangarajan committee, was rupees 32 rupees per person per day in the rural areas. It was in the rural areas and not the urban areas. For the rural areas, the poverty line is rupees 32 per person per day. Rupees 32 per person per day. If any person is spending, then the person was not considered as poor in the rural India in the 2011 current prices. 2011-12 current prices. So there can be a static question also. Which committee recommended the last poverty line in India? It was the Rangarajan committee. What was the recommendation? What were the finding? That the rupees 32 per person per day in rural areas is the poverty line. If anyone is not able to spend about 32 rupees per person per day, then that person is poor. If you can spend more than 30 rupees per day, 32 rupees per day, then you are not poor in the 2011-12 current prices. Now, for the rural areas in 2011-12 current prices, and if we consider the inflation if we consider the inflation, that is consumer price index, the comment was made by the CEO of Niti Aayog. He said that if we take the poverty line of 2011-12, the last poverty line defined by the Rangarajan committee, and we add inflation, then the poverty will come to about 60 rupees per person per day in 22-23. If we add inflation from 2011-12 to 22-23, then the 32 rupees will translate into about 60 rupees per person per day in the rural areas. That is in the rural areas and not the urban areas. In rural areas. So, as per the Niti Aayog CEO, the poverty line currently in India should be around rupees 60 per person per day in the rural India, and based upon which he said that we have seen that bottom 5 to 10%, bottom 5 to 10% people are who are not 0 to 5%, 0 to 5% are spending at an average of 46 rupees per person per day. 46 rupees per person per day. 5 to 10% are spending about 60 rupees per person per day, and if we take 60 rupees per person per day, now that is the average spending of 5 to 10%. That means there are a lot of people in 5 to 10% who are spending more than 60 rupees per person per day. So the CEO of the Niti Aayog said, then we can conclude by this data that the poverty rate in India is less than 10%. Less than 10% of the people in our country are poor. Now this created a lot of hue and cry in the political circles, and they said there are a lot of problems with these datas. Now there are a lot of problems with these estimates. So he said that the poverty line is definitely lower than 10%, and if we take data of 23-24, and if we also take into account the subsidies given by the government, for example, the National Food Security Act, Pradhan Mantri Annadata Kalyan Yojana. So all these schemes are taken together, people are given free ration, subsidized food, then the consumption will increase, and as a result the poverty line could be lower than 5% also. The poverty rate could be lower than 5% also. It is also possible that less than 5% people in India are actually poor enough to not afford even rupees 60 rupees of consumption per person per day. Now this was the comments made, these were the comments made by the CEO of the Niti Aayog. Now if we move forward, we will also look at what are the other poverty estimates. Now what are the other poverty estimates? So if you look at the Niti Aayog's poverty estimate, Niti Aayog has a the index, that is National Multidimensional Poverty Index. National Multidimensional Poverty Index. The Multidimensional Poverty Index is different and National Multidimensional Poverty Index is different. Multidimensional Poverty Index is published by UNDP and Oxford, OPHI, Oxford Poverty and Health Indication. So UNDP and Oxford together publish Multidimensional Poverty Index, but the National Multidimensional Poverty Index is published by Niti Aayog. And in Niti Aayog claimed in 22-23, Niti Aayog said that the poverty rate in India is 11%. The poverty rate in India is 11%. Similarly, the World Bank also estimated that extreme poverty in India is 11.3%. That is also in 22-23. That is the last financial year. That extreme poverty in India is 11.3%, and that is based on the consumption of rupees 49 per day. That is based on rupees 49 per day of consumption. The extreme poverty is 11.3% in 22-23. In 22-23, the extreme poverty is rupees 11.3% based upon 49 per day. And if we take middle income poverty has other criteria also apart from just consumption, that is rupees 49 per day, and it is more than twice of it. If you are able to spend about twice of what you are able to spend in the extreme poverty, then you are considered as middle income poverty, and the middle income poverty in India is 21%. Middle income poverty in India is 21%. So World Bank said that the poverty rate in India is 21%. And the extreme poverty is 11.3%. Similarly, Niti Aayog said, as per the National Multidimensional Poverty Index, that multidimensional poverty is 11.3%. That is 11% is the multidimensional poverty. And similarly, IMF also came with a report. IMF also came with a report. Now, IMF gave, drastically different results than the National Multidimensional Poverty Index as well as the World Bank. IMF said that the extreme poverty is less than 1% in India. The next extreme poverty is less than 1% in India, and middle income poverty is 11%. Middle income poverty is 11%. The IMF said that the extreme poverty is less than 1%. IMF, just did not even take into account the consumption expenditure, but also the subsidies provided by the government were also taken into account. And IMF said that in India, almost none of the population is, the extreme poverty is almost eradicated in India. This is what the papers by the IMF claimed. And the middle income poverty is around 11%. So around 11% people in India are poor, and extreme poverty is almost eradicated. It is around 0.8% or 0.6%. So these were the figures that were given by different bodies. Now, if we look at the poverty estimates, there have been several committees before these committees also. So these were the findings of recent committees which could be useful in your mains. But if you consider the prelims, then these next 3 slides are going to be useful, because there can be question in UPSC where they just give the name of the committee and ask this committee is related to which of the following estimates, whether it is GDP estimate, poverty estimate, or agriculture production. What is this related to? Is it a defense related committee or a science and tech export related committee? So if you have not read it, you will not be able to solve it. So there have been different committees. So Alag committee was formed in 1979, and the Alag committee defined poverty based on calorie intake. The Alag committee defined poverty based on calorie intake. If you take 2400 calories in rural areas and 2100 calories in urban areas, then you are not poor. This was defined in 1979. Then after that came a Lakadwal committee. So what you have to know about these committees, you do not have to memorize the data and the facts, or how much actually was the poverty rate at that particular point of time, or what was the year in which it was published. You just have to remember the name. That Alag committee was the first one which talked about calorie intake and said that 2100 and 2400 calorie line, we have been reading about it in our NCRTs, and this was given by Alag committee. Next came the Lakadwal committee in 1993, and it assumed that the basket of goods and services used to calculate consumer price index of industrial worker and consumer price index of agricultural labor reflect the consumption patterns of the poor in urban and rural areas. So it just assumed that the CPIW and CPIAL are representative of the consumption pattern of rural and urban areas respectively, and the calorie based poverty line remained intact. It also said that the calorie line given by Alag committee is still relevant, and state specific poverty line was also provided by Lakadwal committee. So you first have to memorize the names. Alag committee, Lakadwal committee. Alag committee gave the calorie intake. Lakadwal committee talked about CPI-IW and CPI-AL, and they also gave state-specific poverty line. Next came the 2 most important committees in the poverty estimates. First is Tendulkar committee. So Tendulkar committee gave its recommendation in 2009. This is Mr. Tendulkar, and it issued issues addressed. The issues that was addressed by the Tendulkar committee was the obsolete consumption pattern of the previous committees. The previous committees defined, only on the basis of calories, and the consumption pattern was based on CPI, WL and CPI agriculture labor also. So those were not reflecting the actual consumption expenditure of the people. So obsolete consumption expenditure of the previous methods was one of the issues which is tried to, address. And inflation adjustment did not represent true inflation. The inflation adjustment in the CPI agriculture labor and industrial worker did not represent the true inflation in the economy. And earlier method assumes that the health and education will be taken care of by the state. Now the earlier methods talked about only calories. They did not talk about the health and education, which are important aspects of removing poverty in any country. So these issues were there with the earlier committees. So the recommendations given by Tendulkar committee, first they gave a new basket of goods and services. They did not just talk about calories. They talked about various things like food, education, fuel, entertainment, health. Everything should be included in the consumption basket of the people to estimate poverty. just calories cannot be the basis of poverty. If you are just able to eat food, then you are not poor. That is a very abysmal line of poverty. Now, even after taking food, education, health, all these things, fuel, everything into consideration, they gave a poverty line of rupees 27 per person per day in rural areas and rupees 33 per person per day in urban areas. Rupees 27 and 33 were the poverty line of rural and urban areas respectively, and adjustment to poverty line change as the price also pattern consumption. So they said that as the pattern of consumption changes, the adjustment should be made in the poverty line. So as per the 2011-12 prices, 21, that is 22% of country's people were poor. Now, even after having this abysmal poverty line, that if you have 33 rupees in urban areas, for example, Mumbai, Delhi, Jaipur, Kolkata, Lucknow, Guwahati, you are able to spend 33 rupees per day, then you are not poor. Now, that was an abysmal poverty line, and in rural areas, if you are able to spend 27 rupees per person per day, then you are not poor. Even after having this abysmal poverty line, 22% of the people were still poor as per 2011-12 prices. 22% of the people were poor as per the 11-12 prices. Now, there was a lot of hue and cry over why this abysmal poverty line has been given. Is this a mockery of Indian economy? So, after that, a new committee was formed, that is Rangarajan Committee. So Rangarajan Committee again came, and it tried to address the issues that were there in the earlier committees, and it was set up in the backdrop of abysmal poverty line given by the Tendulkar Committee. So Rangarajan Committee made a certain recommendations. What are the recommendations that were made by the Rangarajan Committee? Apart from calories, you have to include protein and fat also in your food basket. Now, in the food basket, earlier they said that food is not enough, we have to include other things also. But in the food, they did not include anything else than calories. So they said, the Rangarajan Committee said that apart from calories, you have to include protein and fat also, which are also essential for functioning of the body. So you just don't have to consume calories, you have to have sufficient amount of protein, and you have to have sufficient amount of fat, so that your body can function properly. So apart from calories, protein and fat were included, and clothing, footwear, education, edible oil, a lot of new things were included in it, and it changed the poverty threshold. The poverty threshold was increased for urban areas from 33 rupees to 47 rupees per person per day. In urban areas, it was increased to 47 rupees per person per day. In villages, it was increased to 32 rupees per person per day. Now, it increased from 27 to 32, that is 5 rupees increment. And here, it increased from 33 to 47, that is 14 rupees of increment. So, as per this line, 29% of the people were poor. As per Tendulkar line, 22% of the people were poor. As per Rangarajan poverty threshold, 29% of the people were poor. Now, the poverty estimates that are being made by Niti Aayog, in every year, these are based on the recommendation of Rangarajan Committee, and on the basis of Rangarajan Committee, the poverty estimates, Niti Aayog has a task force. Niti Aayog has a task force which analyze the data which are captured by different government bodies. For example, NSO captures the data under NSO, which is under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. It tries to capture data from Indian society, and these data are analyzed by the Niti Aayog task force, and the Niti Aayog task force gives us the poverty estimates. So we see the poverty line defined in 2011-12, the consumption basket was defined in 2011-12. The consumption basket has not been changed after that, and the poverty line was given, which was also very abysmal, 32 rupees per person per day in villages. That is also a very low poverty line, and that is still being carried out. So all the estimates about poverty by the current Niti Aayog CEO was also based on the inflation adjusted poverty line given by the Rangarajan Committee. Inflation adjusted poverty line given by the Rangarajan Committee. So what are the issues with poverty estimates? What are the issues with the poverty estimates that are being currently made? The first is there is no declared poverty line by the Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog does not have any declared poverty line. Niti Aayog is conducting, estimates of the poverty based on the Rangarajan committee recommendation. So whatever was the recommendation of the Rangarajan committee, they just adjust it with the inflation every year and say this is the poverty in India. They have not actually changed the poverty line, which should be happening because the consumption pattern of the people have changed. The consumption pattern of people has changed, and the Niti Aayog is still not changing the consumption basket. Are we consuming the same things that we used to consume in 2011-12? Is internet not part of our lifestyle now? Is internet not a part of consumption of almost every urban household and most of the rural households also? Now there are a lot of things we consume these days. We spend a lot of money on fuel, we spend a lot of money on traveling, we spend a lot of money on entertainment also. In urban areas, the middle class spend a lot of money on entertainment. Even in the poor classes, entertainment, there are different sources of entertainment. For example, YouTube, Instagram is a source of entertainment for poor people also. So the consumption basket has changed, but the poverty estimate line based on the 2011-12 consumption basket made by the Rangarajan committee. So there is no declared poverty line, and it uses not Tendulkar formula but the Rangarajan formula. It uses not the Tendulkar formula but the Rangarajan formula. It uses the Rangarajan formula adjusted by consumer price index. Abysmal poverty line, that is in 2023, Niti Aayog said that the poverty line is rupees 62 per person per day. Poverty line is 62 rupees per person per day in rural areas. If you can spend rupees 62 per person per day, then you are not poor. Now, what do you get in 62 rupees? The cylinder, the 62 rupees will translate into 1800 rupees per person per month. It will translate to around 1800 rupees per person per month. Now, the gas cylinder cost around 800 to 1000 rupees depending upon, the subsidy provided by the government. It is around 800 to 1000 rupees. Then you have fuel, you have fees of the education, then you have food. Even if you get subsidized food from the government, do you eat only that food? Do you not eat anything else? The government gives subsidy only on wheat, rice. These are the two commodities which are majorly given subsidies. Apart from that, some dal and sugar also. Some dal, oil and sugar also are subsidized. But nothing else is subsidized. Do you eat these things only? Do you not eat green vegetables? Do you, even the poor people, are they not allowed to eat bajra? Are they not allowed to eat millets? Are they not allowed to, if they cannot even afford the green vegetables, the gobi, tomato, bhindi, pyaj, do you not use all these things in your food? Even to make, rice and dal, you have to have, onions, you have to have tomatoes, you have to have the mirch also, everything you have to have. So, the consumption of the poor people is not based upon just these basic things. These are the basic things which are subsidized by the government, but there are a lot of other things that the people consume and that cost money. That cost a lot of money, and 62 rupees is still an abysmal poverty line. 62 rupees is still an abysmal poverty line, and the World Bank's extreme poverty talks about 49 rupees per person per day. The World Bank defines extreme poverty as 49 rupees per person per day. Now, if we just eradicate extreme poverty, does that mean the poverty is very low? No, the poverty is not very low. That is only the extreme poverty, which might be around 10%, but the poverty is still very high, much higher than the 10% if we take into account the actual consumption that the people do in the real areas. There are also discrepancies in the data which are provided by the government. Now, the Niti Aayog CEO said that the consumption expenditure has grown 150%. The consumption expenditure has grown 150%. That is 2.5 times. That is 2.5 times since the 2011-12. What he did not tell about, that he is talking about current prices. The 2.5 times, that is 150% increase, also includes inflation. Now, if we remove the inflation, then the real prices, we arrive at the real prices. If we remove the inflation, we arrive at the real prices, and real prices have gone up only. The real increase in consumption expenditure is only 40% in 12 years. 40% in 12 years. Now, what is the average increase? It is around 2 to 2.5% every year. If you are able to increase your consumption expenditure by 2.5% every year, does that mean that it is a phenomenal growth? So he just said that the consumption expenditure has increased 2.5 times. Now 2.5 times is basically 150% increment. And if we remove the inflation from the 150%, we are just left with 40% real growth in 12 years. 40% real growth in 12 years. So this is also not a very good data, and even in the given data, the consumption has increased in the rich people much higher compared to the rural people. The consumption expenditure, they say that even if we take into account that 40% has been the average increase, it is the average consumption expenditure. It is increase in average consumption expenditure by Indian people. This has been the 40%. Now, even if we take into account 40%, the majority of which is the rich people. The rich people and the upper middle class people, these are the people whose consumption pattern has changed drastically. Now, the things which we used to consume in 2011-12, most of us belong to the middle class and the upper middle class families. And what are the things that we are spending upon these days? Good mobile phones and good internet connectivity, and we have use Uber, Ola, these kind of thing. We book flights, so there are a lot of we go on vacation, so we are spending a lot of money on the a lot of entertainment goods and services, and as a result the consumption expenditure of rich and middle class has increased exponentially. So this 40% is an inflated figure if we take rural people into account. If we take rural and the rural poor people, especially in the rural as well as urban areas, this is much less than 40%. The actual increase, the real increase in consumption expenditure in 12 years is much less than 40%. Is it 10%? Is it 20%? Is it 30%? That is for the government to decide. But it is for sure much less than 40%. So the claims about Indian poverty being less than 5%. First of all, that is they are talking about extreme poverty. They are not talking about poverty. They are talking about extreme poverty, because the poverty line that is very abysmal, 60 rupees per person per day, is in itself a very abysmal poverty line. And they are talking about only the rural people. They are talking only about the rural people. Now, the Niti Aayog CEO said that the rural consumption expenditure of around 9 to 10% people is about 1800, less than 1800. So he says that the poverty line is less than 10%. Now, what about the urban people? He has not even talked about the urban people. Second thing, he has not actually talked about the change in consumption basket. Third thing, even if we take the consumption basket of the 2011-12, the line itself is very low. 62 rupees is very low. And after that also, the increase in consumption of 2.5 times compared to 2011-12 does not reflect increase in consumption of the poor people. It does not reflect the increase in consumption of the poor people, because majority of this is increase in consumption of rich and upper middle class people, and as a result the figure is inflated, and the rural people's or the urban people's consumption has not increased as much. So this was all in the news case of this week in economy. Hope you found something important here and something which could be relevant in the exam also. You try to remember the names of the committees, what were the recommendations given by them, not every recommendation and not factual ratifying of the data, but one or two important recommendations which were landmark in the recommendation. For example, Alag committee talked about the calories, or Lakadwal committee talked about every state's poverty line. So these are the things that you should be aware about. There can be a UPSC question based upon these committees. Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you in the next news case. Thank you.